Will you marry me?
Yes! 1,000 times yes!
Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
Is this you when you were young, Mummy?
My children found their father's second wedding photos in the attic. My name is Yeside, and I need to tell you the exact moment my marriage ended. Because it did not end the day I found out. It ended the day my own children handed me the proof, giggling, thinking they had found treasure. They had found their father's second wedding photographs hidden inside a raffia box in our attic, wrapped in a wrapper that was not my own. My son held up the photograph with both hands, so proud of his discovery, and asked me, "Mommy, is this you when you were young? You look different." I looked at the woman in that photograph, standing beside my husband in an asoke I had never worn, in a hall I had never entered, on a day I had never lived through. And I understood, in the space of 3 seconds, that the man I had shared a bed with for 11 years had a whole other life running underneath mine, like a river running beneath a house, unseen, unheard, until the floor cracks open. If this is the kind of story that makes your chest tighten, stay with me till the end, because what my children found in that attic was only the smallest part of a secret that stretched back further than my own marriage, further than I could have imagined. And by the time I understood the whole of it, I was no longer sure whose wife I had ever really been. Before I go on, let me just say, if stories like this move you, stories about the things we bury in the walls of our own homes, do stay close. Subscribe if you haven't, because the road ahead in this one bends in ways you will not see coming. I married Kunle Adewale in a small church in Ibadan 11 years ago, in a wedding my mother had saved for since I was a teenager, in a wedding my father walked me down the aisle with, tears he pretended were dust in his eyes. Kunle was not a rich man then. He drove a rickety Peugeot 504 that coughed black smoke every time it started, and he sold building materials from a small shop in Bodija, cement and roofing sheets and nails, the kind of business that either grows into something or swallows a man whole trying. I loved him the way young women love men who work hard and speak softly, the way you love someone before life has shown you all his faces. My mother liked him because he greeted her properly, because he brought yam and palm oil when he visited, because he looked her in the eye when he spoke, which she said was rare in young men those days. We married in December, during Harmattan, and I remember how the dust made everything look like a dream, soft-edged, uncertain, the whole world wrapped in a haze that made it hard to see too far ahead. I did not know then that the haze was not just weather, it was a warning. I still remember the small things about our courtship, the things I have replayed so many times since that attic afternoon that they no longer feel entirely mine, as though I am watching them happen to a younger, more trusting woman. Kunle used to close his shop early on Thursdays just to walk me home from the tailoring apprenticeship I was doing at the time. A walk that should have taken 15 minutes and somehow always stretched to an hour because neither of us wanted it to end. He proposed to me on a Thursday, in fact, at the small roundabout near Bodija Market. No ring in hand yet, just a question asked plainly, almost shyly, as though he expected me to laugh at him. I did not laugh. I said yes before he had even finished the sentence properly, and we stood there under a dying streetlight while traders packed up their stores around us, and I remember thinking that I had never felt so certain of anything in my life. It is strange telling you this now, knowing what I know, because that certainty was real to me, even if the ground beneath it was not. I do not regret loving him then. I only regret how long it took me to learn what that love was standing on. For the first few years, our marriage was ordinary in the way good marriages are ordinary, unremarkable to anyone watching from outside, but rich on the inside, full of small jokes and small griefs, full of the slow work of building something together. Kunle's business grew. He added a second shop, then a small fleet of delivery trucks, then a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. By the time our twins, Toby and Kemi, were born, we had moved from our one-room flat behind the market into a proper house with a compound big enough for the children to run in, with a boys' quarters at the back where his younger brother stayed whenever he came from the village. I thought I understood the shape of the man I had married. He was ambitious, sometimes distant when business troubled him, generous almost to a fault with his relatives, the kind of man who could not say no to a cousin in need, the kind of man whose mother still called him every Sunday to remind him of his duties to the family name. I thought these were the only currents running through him. I did not know there was a whole separate river. The first sign that something was off came quietly, the way these things always do, dressed up as something ordinary so you don't look too closely. Kunle began traveling more, not the usual runs to Lagos for supplies, but trips to a town 2 hours north of us, a town called Iresa, where he said he had opened a new distribution line. At first, I thought nothing of it. Business grows, men travel, that is the world we live in. But the trips had a rhythm to them that business trips do not have. He went on the same weekend every month, left on a Friday evening and returned Sunday night. And he always came back a little softer, a little more relaxed, the way a man comes from somewhere he has been allowed to put his burdens down. I noticed that he switched off his phone on those weekends, something he never did otherwise, since business called him at all hours. When I asked him about it, he said the network was terrible in Iresa. I believed him because I had no reason yet not to, and because a wife who does not trust her husband without cause becomes a wife who cannot breathe in her own home. But there's a kind of knowing that lives in the body before it reaches the mind, and mine had already begun to hum with a low, quiet unease that I could not name. The second sign came from his mother, though she didn't mean to give it to me. She visited us during the Easter holidays, and one evening, while we sat on the veranda shelling melon seeds, she asked me almost absent-mindedly, "How is Iresa treating our family?" I did not understand the question. She looked confused for a moment, then laughed it off, saying old age was scattering her memory. I let it go that night, because you do not chase your mother-in-law's slip of the tongue across a veranda in front of your own children. But I turned that sentence over in my mind for weeks afterwards, the way you turn over a stone to see what has been living underneath it. Our family, not Kunle's business. Family. The third sign came from money. I managed a small tailoring business from a shop I rented near the market. Nothing large, but enough to keep my own hands busy and my own pocket independent, the way my mother had raised me to always keep something for myself. I did the accounts myself, and it was in doing them one dry afternoon in August that I noticed a standing transfer leaving Kunle's account every month. Not a large sum, but a steady one, sent to an account under a name I did not recognize, Feyisayo or Kunle. I asked him about it over dinner, trying to keep my voice light, the way you try to keep your hands steady when you are afraid of what you might drop. He said it was school fees for a nephew he was sponsoring in Iresa, a promise he had made to a late relative. It was a good lie. It was almost believable. I wanted more than anything that night to believe it, because the alternative sitting quietly at the edge of my mind was too large a thing to hold, so I held the lie instead, because lies are lighter, at least for a while. I want to pause here, because this is usually where I would tell you that suspicion alone drove me to uncover the truth. But that would not be honest, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would tell it exactly as it happened. The truth is, I might have carried that unease quietly for years, the way many women do, weighing the cost of asking against the cost of not knowing, choosing peace over confrontation because peace, even a false peace, pays the school fees and keeps the family together. It was not my own courage that broke the silence. It was my children. If you have ever had the ground shift beneath you because of something small and innocent that a child said or did, you will understand what happened next. And if this story is already gripping you, let it settle in because we're only at the beginning of what that attic held. It happened on a rainy Saturday in October. Kunle had traveled to Iresa the day before on his usual schedule, and I had let the twins play upstairs while I supervised the house help preparing lunch. Our attic was more storage room than attic proper, a low space over the boys' quarters where we kept old furniture, Kunle's late father's boxes, things too sentimental to throw away and too useless to keep in the main house. The children were not supposed to be up there, but children rarely respect the boundaries we draw for them, especially on a rainy day with nothing else to do. I heard them laughing, then arguing, then Toby's small feet pounding down the stairs, calling my name with an urgency that made my stomach drop before I even understood why. "Mommy, Mommy, come and see. Daddy got married again. Come and see the pictures." I remember laughing at first, the confused laugh of a mother who assumes her child has misunderstood something. Perhaps an old photograph from a friend's wedding, perhaps a picture from a magazine. I followed him up the narrow wooden stairs, my slippers slapping against each step, still smiling, still certain this was nothing. It was nothing. Kemi was sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, a raffia box open in front of her, its lid tossed aside, its contents spread across her lap like a fan of playing cards. Photographs. Dozens of them. A wedding, a real wedding, not a costume, not a joke, not something borrowed for a photo shoot. A wedding with Kunle in Agbada I had never seen, standing beside a woman I had never met. Both of them beaming under a canopy of white and gold, both of them wearing rings, both of them surrounded by people clapping, dancing, spraying money the way we spray money at weddings that are real, that are legal, that are meant to last. My son held one of the photographs up toward me, so innocent, so proud of his find, and asked the question that split my life into a before and an after. "Mommy, is this you when you were young? You look different." I could not answer him. I remember my knees finding the floor before I had decided to kneel, the dust rising around me like smoke, my hands shaking as I gathered the photographs, my mind racing to make sense of dates, of dresses, of a woman's face that was not mine, but wore the exact expression I remembered wearing myself on my own wedding day, the expression of a woman who believes in that moment that she has found forever. I did not scream. I want you to know that, because I have thought about that moment many times since, and I am proud, in a strange, hollow way, that I did not scream in front of my children. I told them it was an old photograph from before I knew their father, a costume party, anything, a lie constructed on the spot with the same desperate skill Kunle must have used to construct his own. I sent them downstairs to eat their lunch, and I sat alone in that dusty attic with a raffia box full of another woman's wedding, and I began, methodically, the way you clean a wound before you know how deep it goes, to go through every single photograph, every letter, every scrap of paper that box contained. This is where the story pauses for a moment, because I know some of you are already shouting at your screens, already guessing what I found, and I promise you, you have not guessed the half of it yet. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story like this ends, don't just watch, subscribe, because what came next in that box unraveled a secret that went back further than my own wedding day, and I am only getting started. The photographs were dated. That was the first blow, the one that knocked the wind fully out of me before I had even caught my breath from the first. The wedding in those pictures, Kunle in that agbada, that woman in that ashoke, that hall full of dancing guests, had taken place 8 months before my own wedding to him. 8 months before he stood in front of my family, in front of my pastor, in front of God, and promised to have no other wife but me. I sat there doing the arithmetic over and over, hoping I had misread a date, hoping the ink had smudged and turned a 9 into something else, but there was no mistaking it. My husband had married a woman first, not after me, not during some confused midlife wandering years into our marriage, before. Which meant, by every law of our tradition and our faith that I understood, I had not married a single man. I had married a man who already belonged to someone else, and I had spent 11 years believing he was my first, his only, his one true beginning. Underneath the photographs, folded carefully in a linen cloth, were letters. Old letters, written in a careful, looping hand, addressed to Kunle, signed Your Feyisayo. I am not going to pretend I read all of them calmly. I read them the way you read something you already know will hurt you, hungrily, unable to stop, needing the pain to be complete before you can begin to survive it. The letters spoke of a love that had begun long before I ever met Kunle, in their childhood in Iresa, where their families had been close for generations. There were letters about a promise made by their fathers, a promise I did not fully understand from the letters alone, something about an old debt, an old vow, words like what your father owes my family, and the promise sealed at your birth. There was a letter dated just a year before my own wedding in which Feyisayo wrote, I know your father wants you to marry into money now that the business is growing, but you belong to me first, Kunle. You know this. Whatever you do, you will always come back to Iresa. You will always come back to me. I sat in that attic with those words in my hands and understood with a coldness that settled into my bones that I had not simply been deceived, I had been used. A second, more profitable marriage layered quietly on top of a first one that everyone in Iresa apparently knew about, except me. There was one more thing in that box, tucked at the very bottom, beneath the letters, beneath the photographs, a smaller photograph, more recent, its colors sharper, less faded by time, a boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, standing beside Feyisayo, smiling with Kunle's exact smile, the same slight gap in his front teeth that both my twins had inherited from their father. On the back, in Feyisayo's handwriting, were the words, Femi, 3 years old, Christmas in Iresa. I did the arithmetic again, my hands cold now, my mind refusing at first to complete the calculation because completing it meant admitting that this boy, this Femi, was close in age to my own children, meaning Kunle had fathered him during the very years I believed our marriage was whole, during the very years I was nursing my own twins for fevers and school runs and birthday parties, believing every ounce of my exhaustion was being spent in service of a family that was entirely, faithfully mine. I sat in that attic until the light through the small window began to fade, until the dust settled back onto the floor around me, until I heard the house help calling the children in for their bath, and I understood that I could not simply confront Kunle when he returned from Iresa on Sunday night. I needed to understand the shape of the lie before I stood inside it and demanded the truth, because a lie this large does not survive a single conversation. It survives a lifetime of careful architecture, and I intended to know exactly how it had been built before I brought it down. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside the empty space where my husband should have been, staring at the ceiling, replaying 11 years of my life through a new, terrible lens. Every trip to Iresa, now a visit to a wife. Every late-night phone call, now perhaps a conversation with a son I had never known existed. Every excuse now transparent in a way it had never been before because I had simply never had reason to look for the seams. By morning, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to scream. I was not going to pack his things onto the veranda the way some of my friends had done to their own husbands when betrayal was discovered. I was going to go to Iresa myself, quietly before he returned home, and I was going to meet this Feyisayo, this woman whose name had lived in my husband's bank transfers for years without my understanding what it meant. I needed to see her face. I needed to hear from her whether she knew about me the way I now knew about her, or whether she too was a woman standing on ground she believed was solid. I asked my elder sister Buki to keep the children for the weekend, telling her only that I needed to travel for family matters. And she, God bless her, did not press me further because she has always known when to leave a closed door closed until I am ready to open it myself. I took the first bus to Iresa on Sunday morning, the very day Kunle was meant to return home from that same town, and I remember the strange, sick feeling of traveling toward the thing that had been quietly destroying my life for years, a town I had never once visited, despite my husband spending one weekend a month there as far as long as I could remember. Iresa was smaller than I expected, a town of red earth roads and low houses, the kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone, where a stranger asking directions draws curious eyes from every doorway. I asked a woman selling groundnuts by the roadside if she knew the Oguleye family, and her face changed the moment I said the name, not with confusion, but with recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has just placed a stranger inside a story they already know. Ogunleye, she repeated slowly. You mean Feyisayo's people, the ones connected to their Adewales? My chest tightened at the way she said it, the Adewales, my husband's family name, spoken here in a town I had never visited, as though it belonged here as much as it belonged to me. She gave me directions to a compound at the edge of town, a modest but well-kept house with a low fence and a garden of hibiscus flowers along the walkway. I stood outside that gate for nearly 10 minutes before I found the courage to knock, rehearsing sentences in my head that all sounded foolish the moment I imagined saying them aloud. In the end, it was not I who spoke first. The gate opened and a woman stood there, the same woman from the photographs, older now, softer around the face, but unmistakably her. And behind her, in the yard, a boy who could have been my own son's twin, kicking a football against the fence. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression told me she already knew exactly who I was, though we had never met. You must be Yeside, she said quietly, not as a question. My name, in her mouth, in her compound, in a town I had never set foot in until that morning, undid something in me that I had been holding together by sheer will since the attic. I said, you know who I am, and it was not a question either. She nodded and opened the gate wider and said the words that changed the direction of everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. Come inside. It is time someone told you the whole story, not just the part that hurts. Her parlor smelled of camphor and fried plantain, and there was a framed photograph of Femi's naming ceremony on the wall behind her, a photograph I made myself look at directly, refusing to flinch away from it, because I had decided somewhere on the bus ride into Iresa that I would not survive this conversation by hiding from any part of it. A house help brought us water in tall glasses, and for a moment neither of us spoke, two women measuring each other across a low wooden table, each of us searching the other's face for the specific kind of exhaustion that only a decade of half-truths can carve into a woman. We sat in her small parlor, and Feyisayo told me a story that reached back further than either of our marriages, further than Kunle himself, back to his father, a man named Baba Adewale, and hers, a man named Pa Ogunleye. Decades ago, during a season of hardship that older people in Iresa still spoke of in hushed tones, Baba Adewale was on the brink of losing everything: his small trading business, his land, his standing in his own family. It was Pa Ogunleye who had quietly lent him the money that saved him at a time when no one else in Iresa would touch him, because Baba Adewale had a reputation even then for making promises he did not keep. Pa Ogunleye asked for no interest on that loan, only one condition, spoken in the old way, the way such agreements were sealed in that generation with kola nut and gin and the names of ancestors invoked as witnesses, that the firstborn son of the Adewale family would one day marry into the Oguleye family, binding the two houses together, repaying a debt that money alone could never fully settle. Kunle was that firstborn son. Feyisayo was Pa Oguleye's only daughter. They were promised to each other before either of them could walk. Feyisayo said that even as a small girl, she remembered her father pointing across the market at a skinny boy helping his father load bags of cement onto a truck, saying to her, half in jest and half in deadly seriousness, that one will marry you one day, and if he refuses, his father will owe me more than money, he will owe me his family's name. She said she used to think it was simply something old men said to frighten their daughters into good behavior until she grew older and understood that Pa Oguleye never said anything he fully intended to collect on eventually. We grew up knowing this, Feyisayo told me, her voice steady, but not unkind, the voice of a woman who had clearly turned this story over her own mind for years before speaking it aloud to me. We married in secret, 8 months before he married you, because his father insisted the marriage happen before Kunle's business grew too large, before he became, in his father's words, too important to remember where his blessing came from. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, why then had he gone on to marry me if he already had a wife, if the promise had already been fulfilled? Feyisayo looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition of a pain she herself understood intimately. Because your family had something mine did not have, she said, land near the city, connections in Ibadan, a name that opened doors his own name could not open alone. Baba Adewale wanted his son married twice over, wants to satisfy an old debt of honor that could never be spoken of publicly, and wants to secure a future of money and status that could be shown to the whole world. Kunle did not refuse his father. He has never in his life refused his father anything. I want to tell you that I felt only anger in that moment, but that would not be the truth, and I promised to tell you this story honestly. What I felt, sitting in that parlor, across from a woman who had suffered a version of the same betrayal I had, was something closer to grief. Grief for both of us, two women who had each believed, in our own separate cities, that we were the beginning and end of one man's devotion, when in truth, we were both instruments in a plan neither of us had been permitted to see. Feyisayo told me that she had known about me from the very beginning, had accepted it painfully because she had been raised to believe that a man's duty to his father's promises outweighed a woman's right to his full presence, and because Kunle had promised her that his second marriage was business, while their marriage was the real one. I asked her, and I still remember how my voice shook asking it, whether she believed that. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. I believed it for years, she said. I stopped believing it when Femi was born and Kunle missed his naming ceremony because your children had a school event he did not want to explain missing. A man does not choose the business marriage over the real one, Yeside. There is no real one. They are just two women and one man deciding every single month which lie is easier to maintain that week. If you have ever sat across from someone you believed was your enemy and realized instead that you were both casualties of the same quiet war, you will understand what passed between Feyisayo and me in that parlor. We were not friends. I do not think we will ever be friends. But something in me softened toward her that afternoon, even as the ground beneath my own marriage continued to crumble with every sentence she spoke, because I understood, finally, completely, that neither of us had built this. A man had built this, over decades, with the quiet cooperation of a father more concerned with old debts and new status than with the lives of the women who would be sacrificed to secure both. Before I close this chapter of the story and tell you what happened when Kunle finally faced both of us together, let me just say, if you have made it this far, you already know this story is not the simple, predictable tale it looked like at the beginning. It goes deeper than betrayal. It goes into the old, buried debts our parents leave us to carry, debts we never agreed to and never chose. Stay close, because the confrontation that followed is the part of this story I still have not fully recovered from telling. Kunle did not know I had gone to Iresa. When he returned home that Sunday night, tired from what he believed was a routine weekend, he found the house unusually quiet, the children already asleep at my sister's, and me sitting in the parlor with the raffia box open on the table between us, every photograph, every letter laid out in the order I had found them. I watched something collapse behind his eyes the moment he saw that box. The particular collapse of a man who has spent years believing his secret was buried deep enough to never surface, only to see it laid bare in his own parlor by the wife he thought would never look up from her tailoring long enough to notice the seams of his lies. He did not deny it. I will give him that much. He sat down heavily across from me, put his face in his hands, and for a long time said nothing at all while I waited, my heart pounding, for whatever excuse he had prepared, only to realize slowly that he had not prepared one, because some part of him had always known this day would come, and some part of him, I think, had almost been waiting for it, the way a man waits for a debt he cannot pay to finally be called in. He said, "I never wanted to hurt you." And I remember laughing, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me, because it is astonishing the things men say when they are caught, as though intention could undo 11 years of quiet, deliberate deception. I told him what Feyisayo told me, the debt, the promise sealed with kola nut and gin, his father's ambition dressed up as honor. He did not dispute any of it. He told me, in a voice stripped of all the confidence I married him for, that he had tried, more than once, to end things with Feyisayo before our wedding, that he had gone to his father and asked to be released from the old promise, and that his father had told him plainly that breaking a vow sealed before ancestors would bring ruin not just on Kunle, but on the whole Adewale line. That the business, the house, everything Kunle had worked for existed only because Pa Ogunleye's mercy decades ago had allowed it to exist at all. I was a coward, Kunle admitted, and it is the only sentence from that entire conversation I have never doubted was true. I told myself it was easier to keep both promises quietly than to break either one loudly. I told myself I was protecting you. I was protecting myself. I asked him the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest since the moment I found that second photograph, the one of Femi at 3 years old. I asked him whether he loved Feyisayo more, whether he loved me more, whether either of those questions even meant anything to a man who had spent a decade dividing himself so carefully between two households that neither woman had ever received the whole of him. There was a moment, before I found the words to end that conversation, when Kunle reached across the table and tried to take my hand, the way he had done 1,000 times before over the years, an old reflex neither of us had thought to retire. I let him hold it for perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, I felt the full, dizzying pull of 11 years of marriage trying to drag me back into a version of my life that no longer existed, back into the comfortable lie where I was simply his wife and nothing more complicated than that. Then I pulled my hand away, gently, because I did not want the moment to become another fight, but firmly enough that he understood there was no return to that particular comfort. He asked me, quietly, whether I could ever forgive him. I told him that forgiveness was not the question keeping me awake at night. The question keeping me awake was whether I could ever again trust my own eyes in my own home, and that was a question only time, not an apology offered across a parlor table at midnight, could begin to answer. I did not shout at him that night. I did not throw anything, did not wake the neighbors with my grief the way I imagined some version of myself in a different story might have done. I simply told him that I was taking the children to my sister's house until I decided what came next, and I watched him nod silently, a man finally out of excuses, finally standing exposed in the very house he had spent so many years using as one half of his careful disguise. I am not going to pretend the weeks that followed were simple. There were family meetings, the kind our culture is so practiced at convening. Uncles and aunties from both sides gathered in stiff chairs, speaking in careful, measured tones about what is best for the children and the shame this would bring on both families if the truth became public. Kunle's mother, the same woman who had let slip that single sentence about Iresa on our veranda months before, finally admitted that she had known about Feyisayo since before my own wedding, known and said nothing because, in her words, these arrangements were common in our father's time and a woman's duty is to hold her home together, not to tear it apart over an old debt she does not understand. I remember looking at her. This woman I had called Mama for 11 years, brought yam and palm oil to on every visit, and understanding that her silence had cost me
more than Kunle's lies ever could. Because a lie from a stranger wounds you, but a lie kept by someone who calls you daughter breaks something you do not easily rebuild. In the end, I did not choose the loud public unraveling that some of my friends urged me toward. I did not go to Kunle's church to expose him during a service, did not post his photographs on social media the way one particularly furious friend suggested, though I understood and still understand why some women choose that path. I chose instead to protect my children from the spectacle that would follow them long after their father's shame had faded from other people's memories. I moved out of the house Kunle had built with money that I now understood had been made possible at its very foundation by a debt sealed over a woman's future before she was even born. I took my twins and I took my tailoring business, which had grown quietly over the years, into something steadier than I had given it credit for, and I built a smaller life, but a whole one. A life with no locked boxes in the attic, no silences dressed up as network problems, no second family 2 hours north waiting for a man who could never fully belong to either household. Kunle did not fight the separation the way I expected him to. I think some part of him was relieved to finally carrying the weight of a lie that large, even as he lost the comfort that lie had afforded him for over a decade. He continues to support the twins financially, as he should, and he has, to his credit, tried in his own halting way to be present for them, though the ease we once had between us as a family has never returned, and I do not believe it ever will. Feyisayo, I later learned, eventually left Iresa herself, moving with Femi to Ilorin, where she started a small business of her own. No longer content, she told me in the one phone call we shared months after that afternoon in her palo, to be the real marriage kept in the shadows, while the business marriage lived in the light. Kunle's father, Baba Adewale, the man whose old debt had quietly shaped 3 lives he never bothered to ask permission from, died 2 years after all of this came out into the open, and I am told he never once in those final years expressed regret for the promise he had made over kola nut and gin decades before either Feyisayo or I were born. Some debts, I have come to understand, are never truly paid. They are simply passed down generation to generation until someone finally refuses to carry them any further. My children still ask sometimes about the photographs they found that rainy October afternoon, though they are older now and understand far more than I wish they had to. Toby, my son, asked me once whether he has a brother, and I told him the truth because I decided a long time ago that I would rather my children learn difficult truths from me gently than stumble upon them the way I stumbled upon mine in an attic on an ordinary Saturday, believing they had found nothing more than an old photograph. They have met Femi twice now, awkward, careful meetings arranged more for the children's sake than for any of the adults involved, and I do not know yet what will grow between them, whether time will turn strangers into brothers, or whether the distance their father built between two households will simply become the distance these children inherit in turn. That is the part of this story I cannot yet tell you, because it has not finished happening. Some chapters of a life stay open long after the chapter that broke everything has closed. If there is one thing I have taken from all of this, it is that the foundations of the lives we build are rarely as solid as we believe them to be, and that the people who love us most, a husband, a mother-in-law, even a father long dead, are capable of burying decisions that will one day surface and reshape everything we thought we understood about ourselves. I did not lose my marriage the day I climbed that attic stairs. I lost it years before, the day Kunle chose comfort over honesty, though I did not know it yet. What I found in that attic did not break my life. It simply showed me, at last, the shape of the crack that had been running beneath it for 11 quiet years. I share this story not for pity, but because I know somewhere out there another woman is standing in her own version of that attic, holding a truth she is not yet ready to name, and I want her to know that the ground on the other side of that truth, however frightening it looks from where she's standing, is still ground she can build a whole life upon. If this story reached something in you tonight, stay with this channel, subscribe, because there are more stories like mine waiting to be told, and every one of them is proof that even after the floor cracks open beneath us, we can still learn to stand.